those Smith ladies really were kind of interesting. I said, oh, yeah, I could do a program on that. And then Betty Jo Cugini said, why don't you do it in March? Because March is Women's History Month. So I said, oh, sounds like a plan. March it is. So when I was doing my research, I was looking up Women's History Month, and up came this quote from Nancy Reagan, which I thought was truly important for this talk today. And I think by the end, you'll really get a feel for the hot water these poor ladies were in this Smith granite business. Okay? If you've been around, you have heard about the three Orlandos, the men of the family. All right? And I'm not going to pick on Smith men because my cousin's right over there. So, but it's the men that we usually hear about. The first Orlando is the one that began the granite industry here in Westerly. And the second Orlando, his oldest son, carried it on to its flourishing heyday with monuments all over the country, in Mobile, Alabama, in New Orleans. Ask Ed Fazio, he'll tell you he just came back from those places with pictures. And each of these men, and this is the Orlando Raymond Jr., and he's the one that saved the Babcock Smith House for us so that we would have it as a museum in this town. Very important men, very good businessmen, but they had rather meager starts. This is the first Orlando, and he was a slow starter, shall we say. His mother bought him a farm over in Waterford, Connecticut, and that didn't, he didn't like that. So he went out to Ohio, and he tried to make it work out there, and he didn't like that. And so he came back to this area, and he started a little tiny granite business on Mechanic Street. Nothing elaborate, a little storefront, made steps, hitching posts, fence posts, foundations, minimal. But then he met a girl. Thank goodness. Orlando met Emmeline, and they fell in love, and they were married when Orlando was 31. So he was not a kid anymore. And he had found some granite up here, probably over on Tower Street there, where the water tower is, just down from that. And he found that he could buy this Babcock farm, 800 acres, big farm. And house had been kind of a tenant farm for 20 years, and it was pretty run down. But luckily, Emmeline's father was a carpenter, so he came and rebuilt lots of portions in the north wing and got it much more sturdy and structurally sound. And Orlando finally settled down and really got into the business of the granite business. And he started, again, with the foundations. Now that he had lots of granite available, they could a stone cutter by trade and helped him along. Now, Orlando and Emmeline were childless for 6 years, but then they figured out how it was done. And they had 4 children, 2 years apart. 1851, 1853, 1855, 1857. Orlando dies in 1859. Now, think about my friend, my great-great-grandmother, Emmeline. Here she is, 800-acre farm. All right, that's not bad enough. She's got a granite industry that has been developing. It's now making monuments. It's now getting a little head of steam on. It's getting so that it has several employees to take care of. So here's my dear great-great-grandmother. 4 children, 8, 6, 4, and 2. A farm, not only for food, but to support the granite industry. The oxen were the main muscle in moving the granite. We didn't have diesel engines. And the company is not got a lot of momentum, but it's getting there. Luckily, Orlando's friend, William A. Burdick, now these are cool photos. I want you to think. These photos go back a long way. It's not like I had my iPhone with me and took them. This is a picture of William A. Burdick, the stonecutter and friend of Orlando and Emmeline. He lived just down the hill at what is now called the Roger Williams Inn. And so it was just a short buggy ride up the hill to the granite company. Now things continued along. Emmeline was boss. She owned the company fully in her name. And we don't have records back until 1882. And she died in 86. So there's just a 4-year period that we have where she was boss. But she carried on. William A. was her front man, but she was the boss. All right? And she raised the children. Her oldest, Orlando Raymond, grew up in the granite business, and we'll talk more about that when we go to the next generation. But her second son, Isaac, was not as healthy. He had weak lungs, whether he had tuberculosis, whether he had COPD, I don't know what they had, but he went down to North Carolina, near Asheville, and to get the mountain air that was supposed to be so good for the lungs. And Emmeline went down to visit him, and there was a train accident, and she was killed in Fletcher, North Carolina. And that marks an end of an era in the granite business. The granite business will no longer, the Smith Granite Company will no longer be a one-person company. It was incorporated in 1887, shortly after Emmeline's death. Whoops.
How old was she when she passed away?
She died in, I can't tell you. I'll have to do my arithmetic when I'm not on the spot. Whoa. Now, Orlando Raymond was only 8 years old when his dad died. All right, now he's the man of the house. And I'm sure he had responsibilities here on the farm, but he also had responsibilities over at the granite company. And he had on-the-job training, shall we say. But he's only 8 years old. You know, 8 years old, he's probably taking a letter over to William Burdick from his mother or something like that. But as he grows, he gets more and more into it.
And it's a long time. It's a long time before it's over there at the, nope, at the door. The overhead, that's it, thank you. So, after his mother's death, he let's go back a little way before his mother's death. In 72, 6 years before she died, he meets and marries Sarah Chapman. Now, Sarah is just a young thing. Isn't she pretty and cute? And 15 months after the wedding, count them 15, they have baby Annie. And it's just adorable. But neither Sarah nor baby Annie really recovered good health after the childbirth. Sarah died about a year later. Baby Annie died about a year and a half. And Tony and I, my cousin and I, have always heard this child referred to as baby Annie, even though it's several generations before us. So here's Orlando Raymond, got a farm, got his mother to take care of, granite business. So he says, I need a wife. So he marries again, the older sister of his first wife. He had good luck with that family, stick with it. All right. This is Julia. And they married in 1885. And starting 2 years later, in 2-year intervals, we had Orlando Raymond Jr., Sarah, Julia Grace, Emmeline Gallup, and Martha Jane. Bing, bing, bing. So, this is kind of tough on women, and all of a sudden, I don't know why Julia died. She died when the youngest was 7 years old. So I don't know why she died, but they had been married 17 years. And here is poor Orlando. Now he not only has a farm and a granite business, but he has Orlando, Sarah, Julia, Emmeline, and Martha. 5 children. What does he need? A wife. So he goes back to the Chapman family again. He ran out of sisters, so he married a younger cousin, Jenny Chapman. This is Jenny here. This is her wedding day. Now this is really cool. This is a very long time ago. And this is Orlando right here. He marries a 3rd time. He married, Jenny was, his new wife was 22. Now pay attention to these numbers. Let's see. This is his new wife. This is Jenny. She's 22. Orlando, the boy, is 16. Have you ever had 16-year-old boys in your house? Have you ever tried blending a family? Stepmothers are not always the most favorite characters in the world, and when they're only 6 years older, it's a little sticky. Sarah was 14, Julia was 12, Emmeline was 10, and this is probably Martha, who was 8. Now that's not bad enough. In great regularity, in 2-year intervals, come Franklin, Isaac, and Edward. In the meantime, this is a tremendously busy time for the company. The company is really going full bore. We're sending monuments to Gettysburg, Chickamauga, all over the country. These are the heyday years of the Smith Granite Company. And of course, Orlando didn't have enough on his plate. He had to operate a steamboat line up and down the Pawcatuck River because he's a guy. Anyway. And Orlando was getting ready to make a business deal. He was going to merge with the Joseph Newell Company over on Oak Street, and they were going to be Smith and Newell. And we have found records just this week, following Hugh's research, of state documents giving the name of this new company, and it was going to be Smith and Newell, and everything was going along all right, but Orlando was sick, very sick. I think it was liver cancer, but it's hard to tell with what data we have. He went to Pittsburgh, and they wouldn't operate, and my great-grandmother tells that they operated on him in the parlor, or on the dining room table. That was it, on the dining room table. He didn't make it. But in the midst of all this frenzied activity, he dies in 1898. The business merger, so dependent on Orlando and his charisma and his business contacts and his knowledge of the business, falls through. Newell sues Smith because they didn't keep up, that's another study. I haven't really researched that, so I really don't know what the details are, but there was a lawsuit. And eventually, Smith retained the assets of the company here on Quarry Hill, and Newell got the cash. So, here we are. This is my great-grandmother. Jenny is 27 years old. She has a farm to run. She has a 21-year-old stepson who has to leave college to come home and run the show here. She has 4 teenage stepdaughters, 13, 15, 17, and 19. Ever had teenage girls in your house? 4 of them, stepdaughters. And if that's not enough, she has 3 preschool children, 4, 2, and Edward was a month old when Orlando died. Now, this is what you call a full plate. It just amazes me how, and if that's not enough, the company's in court. All right? Now, Orlando left Brown University to come home and help his stepmother with the many business responsibilities. But the bank wasn't too thrilled with this 21-year-old kid with no experience being in the midst of all this, so the bank set up an overseer to monitor the business. Well, things were pretty glum. It's a big company, 400 people on the payroll. So, and all the cash went in the settlement of the lawsuit, and I'm not saying that was wrong, it just was, there's just no cash. So in the dark of night, they shipped out this mausoleum. This is the White Mausoleum. It's in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they snuck it out of here so that they could ship it to Mount Auburn and set it and complete it and get the money. And it was a hefty $32,500 back then. Now it would cost you $2 million if you could get it. But that gave them a little bit of elbow room. They could make their payroll for a bit. But it wasn't easy. They had to be alert to any ways that they could make headway. Now, old-time Westerly residents might remember this house. It was right across Cross Street. That was the home of Orlando Raymond. He built it for his first wife. When he got his second wife, whoops. Get it right. When he got his second wife, he built this addition, which was a dining room and a kitchen, and oh, it was very posh for its day. When he got his third wife, he built this tower on it. He wouldn't want his wives to feel that they weren't the most important. But Jenny ran the house. Orlando worked in the business with his mother's help and advice. And money was tight. Now this gal, 22 when she married, was marrying into a very wealthy, posh, I mean, who's going to get a tower just built on the house because you got married, you know? And here we are, 5, 6 years later, and things are tight. So she rented a room in this big house, and she rented it to Alice Phoebe Barber, who was a school teacher right up here on Quarry Hill School, which was where the Rite Aid is now. And Alice boarded there. Well, little by little, the situation eased. The children grew up, as teenagers do, and they leave the house, and life gets simpler. Jenny was at home. Orlando was still living at home. The toddlers had become young boys. And again, this is the boys are maybe 10 years old here, so this is 1905, 1908.
Which one is your grandfather?
Tony? I think it's that one. Do you? Poppy Smith.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're right.
I think this is Franklin, the oldest.
Absolutely.
And this, I think, is Edward, the youngest, who was a month old when Dad died. I think this is my grandfather. Now, all of these boys grew up. They all went to Brown University and graduated and returned to Westerly to work at the Smith Granite Company. Jenny lived a long time. Tony and I well remember her. She lived to see the Granite Company beset by huge downtimes with the Great Depression, where there was no money to buy anything, and you weren't going to spend $32,000 on a mausoleum when it was hard to buy a chicken, you know? And then came World War II. There was money, but you couldn't get the stuff. You couldn't get the steel. You couldn't get the rubber. You couldn't get all of these things. So, and which comes first, the war or gravestones? You know, it was a very wise allocation of assets, but it hit the Granite Company hard. And the Smith Granite Company went out of business in it's kind of went through several death throes. Somewhere between 48 and 55. It went through various changes, but none of them were real effective. Jenny had been married 5 years. She lived as a widow 65 years. Now let's go backtracking and talk about her son, Orlando Raymond Jr. He's living at home with his mom across the laneway there. His Aunt Julia is living in this Babcock Smith house. And the school teacher's rooming there. Well, they get to know each other and they kind of fall in love, and he decides he needs a wife. So they get married and they live in the Farmer's Cottage, which was a little cottage where the Westerly Community Credit Union now is. Those of us who have been around Westerly a while, in our day, Sammy French and Stewie French lived there. In 1924, Orlando's Aunt Julia died and left him the house, the Babcock Smith house. Now, Orlando Raymond Jr. was a real antique buff. He was very interested in this house, and he was responsible for the 1928 colonial restoration. During the Victorian times, we've got porches and balconies and decks and all kinds of doodahs all over the place. In fact, those windows up there were part of the front hall. But in 1928, Orlando hired Isham, Norman Isham, a very well-known restoration expert, and they went through this house. They put, they got rid of all the Victorian gingerbread. They enlarged the dining room, and if you take a tour of the house, the docents will tell you how they matched the paneling and everything. They added the butler's pantry. The fireplaces on the first floor are brownstone. They were once Delft tiles, like the ones upstairs, but in the years as a tenant farm, they had been damaged beyond repair, so they were replaced with brownstone fireplace lintels. And he installed a steel beam in the keeping room. And we are very indebted to Orlando for doing that, because a lot of other colonial houses are struggling with having to do this. We don't have to, because Orlando did it for us. He oversaw the selection of wallpaper and tried to be as authentic as he could in returning the house to its colonial look. And many of the furnishings that we have now in the museum were part of his collection. Orlando died in 1932, only 4 years after the major restoration. Now, he and his wife never had any children. And he thought he was doing her this great favor. He was going to give her life tenancy in this house, and then after her death, a trust would take over and administer the house. Well, this was in 1928, before the crash. You know, lots of elbow room as far as cash is concerned. Had no clue what he was doing to his dear wife. Now, his wife, from 1932 to 1972, 40 years, took care of the Babcock Smith house and kept the Smith boys from coming in and wrecking the place. Tony and I were never allowed in the house. I mean, Aunt Alice kept the house just to keep it nice. But she didn't have a lot of money. Now think, from 1928, 1929 was the crash. Then you have 10 years of major effects from the Depression, barely getting over that, and you get into Pearl Harbor and World War II, and Then the day after VJ Day, the bank foreclosed on the mortgage here. So it was not an easy task for, we called her Aunt Alice, to maintain this house. There were not a lot of funds available. This is a big house. It's a big property. And she had to petition the courts in order to sell the parcel of land to the credit union so that she could have some income to take care of the expenses of running the house. So it's to her efforts that we have the museum in such wonderful shape. So Alice did not have a lot to do with the granite industry as such. Her contribution was more in preserving the museum house. She was the wife of Orlando for 20 years, his widow for 40. Let's look at these three widows. The first, Emmeline. She was married for 14 years, widowed for 28. Jenny was married for 6 years, widowed for 65 years. And Alice, 20 years she was married. She had the longest marriage. And then 40 years as a widow trying to take care of this place. A total of 131 years of widows preserving the heritage that we enjoy here. Women with the strength of stone carried on our story. And I particularly like this monument that's in Evanston, Illinois. And it has 3 statues of 3 women on it. The allegorical statues are faith, hope, and love. And you have these 3 women supporting the granite industry with faith, hope, and love. And to them, we are, the present generation, are greatly indebted. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes?
How do you go about sneaking out a structure like that? I mean, you had to have cranes and trains.
Well, they had it, I don't know, they didn't ask us, but it was pretty sneaky. And they did it at night, and, you know, they had it all done ahead of time. People don't know exactly what's going on. So move one granite stone, they all look alike, you know. So, and to the uninitiated eye, it was probably not evident what was happening. But it was to her advantage. But do you see what I mean about hot water those poor ladies were left in? Whoa. So the men get all the credit, and the women made it happen. Well, thank you for coming today. It was very pleasant.